So here we are, finally, it seems, at the Civil War. It feels like this is a topic that we have been building to really throughout the entire course, ever since we talked about the beginnings of colonization. We talked about how there were just inherently, from the very beginning, from the very get-go, differences between the northern areas and the southern areas, and then we've seen those things grow deeper and deeper and more pronounced. And where we left off last time, we went through that whole decade of the 1850s, seeing things grow more and more difficult, and the situation over slavery becoming just a very extremely divisive issue, and one that both sides eventually get to a point where they are no longer willing to compromise. So let's pick up from where we left off at the end of chapter 10. Which, if you recall, what had happened, the last thing we talked about was the election of President Abraham Lincoln and the first wave of secession. So about 11 southern states, in response to Lincoln's election, secede from the Union, claim at least to have left the Union. They are no longer a part of it, and form their own country, which they call the Confederate States of America. And where we left off, we're kind of in that waiting game, as people are kind of waiting and watching to see what's going to happen when Lincoln takes office. Because all of that secession stuff was happening while Lincoln was the president-elect, but not the president yet, because he won't take office till March of 1861. In the meantime, while all of that stuff was going on, the president at the time was President James Buchanan. And President James Buchanan kind of sends mixed signals when the secession crisis occurs and the Confederacy is formed. He says he doesn't like secession. He says he disagrees with it. He says it's not legal. He says it's not right, and that it's not a good thing, and it's not good for the country to be torn apart like this. Yet he doesn't do anything to stop it. He certainly does not try to force the South back into the Union or try to even negotiate. He just kind of lets it happen. So he says he doesn't like it on the one hand, but doesn't do anything about it either, and kind of seems to be willing to just let Lincoln handle it when he comes into office a few months later. In fact, even though President Buchanan is saying that he doesn't like secession, that he doesn't agree, and all of that, he actually is pretty much giving these southern states that are seceding everything that they want. He's playing right into their hands, because what he's doing is he's turning over all of the federal properties to the Confederate states. And what that means is, in those southern states, there were some properties that were federal properties, meaning they belong to the United States government. And keep in mind from here forward, whenever we talk about the federal government or federals or anything federal, you're talking about the North, because that means the United States, and that's the Union. So you have mainly military forts is what you're talking about. You had military forts throughout the South, or perhaps arsenals or different things like that. But those are federal properties belonging to the United States. And so what would happen when southern states would secede is that they would demand that those federal properties, like those military forts, be turned over to them, and that they become Confederate properties at that point and no longer properties of the United States. And Buchanan had pretty much done that. He had pretty much allowed the South to take over all those federal properties, to occupy them, except for one. By the time that Buchanan leaves office, there's only one major military installment in the South, in the Confederacy, that still technically belongs to the Union, and that is Fort Sumter, which is in South Carolina, right out there in Charleston Harbor. So that is in Confederate territory, but the Union still occupies it and still holds on to that fort out there in Charleston Harbor. So this is where the first showdown is going to take place. This is where the war is eventually going to begin, is this showdown over Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. So when Lincoln takes office in March of 1861, he kind of implies that he doesn't want to use force, but he certainly doesn't rule it out, because he says, I don't want to use force against you to the South, but I can't just let you walk away either, and I'm not going to let this country fall apart, and I will do what I have to do in order to preserve the Union. I don't want to fight you and to have to do that, but he certainly implies that he's willing to do that if it's necessary. But when Lincoln takes office in March of 1861, he sends a fleet of ships to Fort Sumter for the purpose of resupplying the fort, because by this time they're starting to run out of medical supplies and equipment and food and things like that, and the Confederacy is dead certain that they're not going to allow Lincoln to resupply the fort, because that would be like saying that the United States government still controls it. So at this point, the Confederacy gives an ultimatum to the United States government, to Lincoln, demanding that if Lincoln does not hand over Fort Sumter to them, that they are going to fire upon it. And so this is the moment where everybody's waiting with bated breath to see what's going to happen. And Lincoln certainly has absolutely no intention of turning over that fort to them. And, he kind of knows this is where something's about to happen, but he wants, the South to be the one to get it all started, which they do. So Lincoln refuses to hand over Fort Sumter, and the Confederacy has given their ultimatum of April the 12th, 1861, and so a little bit after midnight on April 12th, 1861, the Confederates make good on that threat, and they start firing upon Fort Sumter from Charleston. And they bombard Fort Sumter with their artillery, shelling it, hitting it with their guns for about 24 hours before, or 33 hours to be precise. After a 33-hour bombardment, Fort Sumter was surrendered to the Confederacy. So they are successful in taking over Fort Sumter, and it is surrendered to the Confederacy at that point. But the overall significance of this is that the Civil War had begun. The Confederate firing upon Fort Sumter is the beginning of the Civil War. The fighting has started. Ironically enough, there were actually no human casualties in the fight at Fort Sumter. It's kind of ironic that what's going to end up being the bloodiest and costliest war the United States has ever been involved in started out actually with no human casualties. So now let's take a look at what happens in response, in reaction, and in the weeks following Fort Sumter. Because to many people, it's easy for us to, because we know the outcome. We know this is going to erupt into a 4-year long and ugly struggle. But people at the time certainly didn't know that. So let's take a look at how people felt about this and sort of what the next moves were on both sides, particularly for President Lincoln. So in response to Fort Sumter, President Lincoln's next move was that he issued a call out to the states, the ones that remain in the Union, for 75,000 volunteers to fight to preserve the Union. So he's asking for 75,000 people to sign up to fight. And at this point in time, this is kind of going off on a side note, but it's an important one, that idea about preserving the Union is very crucial. That Lincoln believes, and Lincoln is making it clear at this point, that the purpose of the war is to preserve the Union. It's about keeping the country together. It's about making sure that the South doesn't leave, about making sure that the United States doesn't fall apart. In other words, he's very careful right here to say that it's about preserving the Union and not about slavery. Now, obviously, that's not always going to be the case. We will eventually see that change. So that's something I want you to make sure you watch out for, and we'll talk about a lot over the next couple of days, is how that gets transformed, how the war becomes a fight to do both. To free slaves and to end slavery, as well as preserving the Union. But for right now, Lincoln's being really careful about what he says the war is about. We will talk later about why he wants to be so careful with that, but he's saying this is about preserving the Union. But when Lincoln first took office, he said, I don't want to fight you if I don't have to. But certainly when he calls for these 75,000 volunteers to fight, it's clear that he does think he's going to have to fight and that he will fight. And that leads to an important development. So Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to fight to preserve the Union causes a second wave of secession. The group of states that seceded from December of 1860 to February 1861, the ones that formed the initial Confederacy, we call that the first wave of secession. But there's a group of 4 more southern states that are going to secede now in response to Lincoln's calling for volunteers. That includes Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. They say, we're not going to send people, we're not going to, send our citizens to go attack South Carolina. We would rather join them than fight them. These are states that had originally kind of said, all right, we're not going to secede, but we want you to leave them alone. We respect, South Carolina and Alabama and all the rest of them. We respect their decision to secede, so we expect you to leave them alone. And when Lincoln issues this call for volunteers, it's clear that he doesn't intend to leave them alone. So they join the Confederacy. So we see a second wave of secession. That's good for the Confederacy. This is the point where the capital of the Confederacy will be moved from Montgomery to Richmond, Virginia, where it'd be closer to the action and closer to Washington. This does leave 4 slave states still in the Union. We tend to think incorrectly that the Civil War is all slave states versus free states, and it isn't. There are 4 slave states that actually will stay in the Union throughout the entire war. They are Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware. The one that we're going to spend the most time talking about is going to be Maryland. We'll look at that one in a later section, so we'll come back to it. But we call these the border states. So they're border states because they are literally, as you can see on this map here, you see the yellowish gold ones. Those are those states that I just mentioned. Now, this map does show West Virginia, what would today be West Virginia. That was actually part of Virginia still at this point. This is actually the moment where it becomes West Virginia, because it becomes its own thing, because those western counties of Virginia didn't want to secede and didn't go along with the rest of Virginia. But anyway, these are states that are literally on the border between North and South, but specifically what that means is these are slave states that stay in the Union. Again, Maryland is the one that's going to be the trickiest. That's where we're going to see Lincoln do some pretty extreme, and some would argue very controversial, maybe even borderline on legal or illegal, to keep Maryland in the Union. So keep your ears open for that. We'll talk about Maryland a lot later. All right, let's take a look at kind of how both sides, the Union and the Confederacy, stack up when the war begins. Keeping in mind, just make sure you understand from this point forward, because I will use the words interchangeably, that the South is the Confederacy and the North is the Union. And sometimes you'll see the word federal or hear the word federal to describe them as well. We want to take a little snapshot at some of the disadvantages that both sides have, at least at the beginning of the war, and kind of what their overall strategies and plans were going into it. Now, both the Union and the Confederacy, after Fort Sumter and after that second wave of secession, they're going to be busy making their plans, militarizing themselves, gathering troops, training troops, supplies, and setting out their strategies. But both sides at this point think the war is going to be quick. No one really had any clue, and how could they, as to how long and devastating this was going to be. So both sides are actually kind of thinking this might last 6 months at the most, maybe even less. Let's start by taking a look at the Confederacy, or the South, and take a look at some of their strengths at the beginning of the war, some of the things that they have going for them. This includes a much higher morale at the beginning of the war, remembering that morale means their spirits, their attitude. They overall just have higher spirits and higher morale, at least at the beginning. They are much more united, and they're much more clear about what the war is about, and it's much more popular in the South, at least in the first couple of years. They're kind of united around what they are fighting for, what's really strange is that when secession happens and the war begins, the South would have been very united around this idea that the war was about independence, that it was about securing independence for the Confederacy, that it was about fighting for their right to secede. It's, they don't talk about the slavery thing too much, so we have to remember that that's certainly there, but they would have been united around this idea of independence and freedom, and therefore keeping slavery and all those kinds of things, their way of life, their economy, their independence to do what they wanted to do. But they also do better militarily in the first couple of years of the war, and so that's going to contribute to their higher morale as well. When they're winning, it's easy to have higher morale. They also are going to be familiar with the territory a lot of the time, as a lot of Civil War battles, most of them are going to be fought on Southern soil. So majority of the time they have that home field advantage that we're talking about, have talked about before. So that means knowing the layout of the land, understanding the territory, kind of being in a more friendly environment, and having better understanding of where they are and the terrain and the ground and all that kind of stuff will help them out quite often. The whole idea that they are oftentimes fighting on their own soil also kind of gives them an additional motivation. Some of those words that are covered up there are additional motivations to fight, because they are defending their home, they are defending their land, they're defending their own states from what they considered an invasion. To them, and again, this is all kind of wrapped up in the idea of higher morale and all that, for many Southerners, they just felt like the stakes were higher. They had more to lose. They felt that it was not just about independence. It was not just about this small thing, but they were also protecting something that was really important to them. And if they lost, it was their very way of life that was threatened by that. It was their very existence that was threatened by that. It's a bit more personal to them than it is for the Union sometimes. And this is what would motivate so many people to fight that aren't slave owners. So a lot of people ask all the time, well, how, the South couldn't have been fighting for slavery because most of the people fighting didn't even own slaves. That is true, that most of them weren't slave owners. I do think the slavery thing absolutely is part of it, but I think the average soldier probably wouldn't tell you that's what they were fighting for. They might say that they were defending their home and all of that. Now, again, the slavery thing is absolutely a part of it. I don't think there's any way around that at all. But they certainly felt that there was more to it than that, and they would have argued that that wasn't the only reason. Okay, but of course there are a few other pluses for the South, is that the countries, they have better military leadership and better soldiering skills at first. The South just had a stronger military tradition, particularly with the Army. It just so happened that if you looked at the United States Army in 1860 and 1861, when the war begins, that the most talented military commanders, military leaders, and all of that just happened to be from the South. And so they kind of get the best ones. And so we'll see several different examples of, Civil War generals from the South that are just better at what they do. They're smarter, they're more innovative, they're gutsier, all of that. But not just the military leadership, but Southerners being more likely to live in rural areas. They're more likely to be skilled at hunting, at shooting, at horseback riding, things that translated well into military life. And so there's just lots of ways that they were just better at all of that than their Union counterparts were. Now, that's something that the Union is going to get better at as time goes along, but certainly at first the South has the advantage in some cases being able to literally run circles around the Union Army and defeat them and really humiliate them a lot of the time, even though they were outnumbered and different things like that. But there are, of course, a lot of weaknesses. The strengths are going to help the South to do well in the beginning, going to help them win a lot of battles, but their weaknesses are the things that are going to get to them in the end. And largely what this is going to mean is that the South cannot carry on this war for a long period of time, it's going to go on for a long period of time, and they're not going to have the ability to last the amount of time that would have been necessary. We know, we've talked many, many times already about how the South is not industrialized. The South has not gone through, they have resisted industrialization, they have resisted manufacturing, they have resisted all those kind of modernizations. It's a very agricultural economy, and that's going to really bite them during this, because without industry, without manufacturing of their own, they're not going to be able to produce weapons, military goods, other kinds of supplies, even things for people at home, consumer goods. They're not able to supply themselves, and they're certainly not able to supply themselves with the kinds of things and for the amount of time that they would need to do for a long and modern war. We also know the South has resisted a lot of transportation innovations, those internal improvements, roads and railroads and that kind of thing. They have resisted that. So without a lot of railroads, without a lot of good roadways, it's going to be difficult to transport troops from one place to the other, to get supplies from one place to the other, to communicate from one place to the other. It makes what little transportation they do have much more vulnerable, and if the Union is able to get their hands on it and destroy those things, and they will, that makes life even more difficult for them. So the fact that they don't have a modernized economy becomes a huge weakness. Overall, actually, the South's economy is probably their greatest weakness. Now, the lack of industry and the lack of transportation systems is a part of that, but overall we know that their economy hasn't changed all that much ever since, the 1600s. It's an overwhelmingly agricultural economy that just simply does not produce the kind of wealth, the kind of cash that you need to finance a modern war, and certainly to finance a modern war for 4 years. We keep talking about, and sometimes we think about the South as being incredibly wealthy. We imagine these big plantations and these estates and these mansions and this really rich planter class. But keep in mind that really rich planter class represented a tiny, tiny, tiny portion of the Southern population. And the other thing we have to understand is that, yes, there was a lot of wealth in the South, but it's tied up in slavery. It's tied up in the land itself. It's not in actual cash. So they're kind of land rich and cash poor. So that's something that really affects them. And they're just not able to pay for this kind of a thing. And so their economy is probably their overall biggest weakness. A lot of historians would even argue that the Southern economy defeats them before the Union Army does. That, it doesn't really matter how many battles you can win. If your economy's falling apart, you're going to not be successful, which is exactly what kind of happens. The Confederacy's government is also part of their weaknesses. It's a weak government. It was intentionally and by design a weak central government. Remember that it is a confederacy. Think about the Articles of Confederation and how that was a loose and weak central government and more power to the individual states. That's exactly what they wanted, but that's kind of a problem in a war. You know, a war kind of demands centralized power. It demands a central authority to say, here's what we're going to do. Here's the plan. Here's what we need the states to do. Let's get it done. But with a government that's based on states' rights and where each individual state has the ability to say, no, we're going to do this or no, we're going to do that, that makes it very hard to kind of get everybody on the same page to do what needed to be done. And there are examples later throughout the war when some southern states said, we're not sending any more soldiers, we're not sending any more money, we're not sending any more supplies, we have our own problems and we can't do that. And there really wasn't much that they could be done. Now, overall, the Confederacy strategy is not super, it's specific, but it's not like a step-by-step kind of a plan. Overall, their strategy was to fight a defensive war, to fight defensively, not to go taking the war to the enemy, not to go looking for battles, but just to kind of hold what they had and then wear out the Union Army. And it was their belief that if they could have success in a handful of defensive battles, then the Union would give up, and that they would give up relatively quickly, that it would be kind of like how the British eventually gave up trying to, get the colonies back in line because they knew it just was going to be impossible, that the colonists would never stop fighting. And that's kind of what they're thinking here. But for the most part, they know that they don't have the numbers. They know they don't have as many supplies. They know they don't have as much money. So they're not going to go on these campaigns on their own. They just want to hold on to what they've got. But at the same time, so the defensive strategy is sort of point one of their plan. Point two is to get foreign recognition, to get a foreign alliance, to get a foreign country to recognize the Confederate States of America as a legitimate nation and as an independent nation. And if they could get that, like the way the United States did from France during the Revolution, then that could likely end the war in their favor right there. They are most hopeful that that could probably come from Britain, and that's the country that probably gets maybe the closest to recognize the Confederacy, although we will see later they will not actually do that, and we'll talk later as to why. And that's an important thing to talk about at another time. So fight defensively, get foreign recognition, and wear the Union Army out. Now let's take a look at the Union. Now obviously some of the things that were Confederate strengths are going to be Union weaknesses and vice versa, so some of these we can go through relatively quickly, but there's also a few things that are pretty specific that we want to make sure we talk about in regard to the Union and their overall strategy, which is much more clearly laid out with specific parts, more of a clear plan. As far as strengths for the Union, if the economy is probably the biggest weakness for the Confederacy, it is probably the biggest strength of the Union. It is a much more diverse economy. It is not just based on one thing. We know that there's manufacturing, there's shipping, there's trade, there's businesses, there's all kind of things, and there's agriculture in the North too, so they're not completely without that. It is just stronger, it is wealthier, it has the ability to produce the kinds of things that they're going to need, and it has the wealth to produce the kind of cash that you would need to finance and pay for a long war. So they are not going to struggle nearly with the kinds of shortages, with the kinds of problems both in the military aspect of the war and at home for their people. So they have the industry and the factories to produce military supplies, to produce consumer goods, and their economy is actually going to emerge bigger and stronger and wealthier than it was going into this. This is going to cause a big economic boom in the North, economic success, whereas the South economy is going to be in shreds by the time this is over with. The Union also has a strong Navy. Now that's something we didn't talk about with the Confederacy because they don't have a Navy. All of your major naval bases and shipyards were in the North. Most of your important naval commanders, sailors, all that stuff was in the North. So the South is going to have to build a Navy pretty much from scratch. And we never get the chance to talk too much or really to talk at all about the naval war that's going on the water. But we should remember that that was happening simultaneously to all the land battles. And when it came to the naval war, the Union almost always has the advantage there. They also have a higher population. There's a heck of a lot more people in the North than there are in the South. You're talking about maybe 22 million people in the North to probably a little bit less than 10 million in the South. So therefore they have more troops, they have more reinforcements. They're going to be able to keep on going and going and going. Immigration is picking up again at this point, and there are examples of people getting off the boat from Europe and they immediately draft them into the Union Army and to the front they go. But they're able to carry on longer for that reason. As far as weaknesses of the Union, there are several of those, of course, and things that they're going to have to struggle with throughout the war, and times where they will have to, while they have to be careful, particularly about what they say the war is about, like with Lincoln and the kind of tiptoeing around the slavery issue. In the early years of the war, militarily speaking, the Union did have poor leadership. They struggled with soldiering skills. All that just simply wasn't as good. They struggled to get good people in command. They have people that, have the pedigree, but when it came to it, just made poor decisions, were hesitant, just made, for lack of a better word, dumb military decisions. And there's a lot of battles where they should have won it, but they end up getting not only defeated but practically humiliated by the South. Their soldiering skills are not quite as good, but those are areas that they will eventually get better, but it takes a while, and it takes a lot of humiliating defeats, and that can be very damaging for your morale. Their military difficulties in the first couple of years lead to very, very low morale. Oftentimes the war is unpopular. There are a lot of people in the North that don't support it, or that don't support it if it's about certain things, or that don't support it once it goes on for so long or whatever. So they're not as united in favor of it. They are not as united about what they're fighting for and why they're risking their lives. That can be quite divisive, particularly over the slavery question. This is going back to what I was saying earlier. There are plenty of people in the North that say this has to be about preserving the Union and only about preserving the Union. In other words, it's not about slavery. There are people that would say, I'll fight a war to preserve the Union, or I'll support a war for that, but not to end slavery. And then you've got plenty of other people that say, no way, slavery has got to be what this is about. There's no point in fighting a war like this if we're going to leave slavery alone. This has to be it. So that becomes very much a divided issue, and that's a tricky thing for Lincoln to negotiate and to kind of tiptoe around, and it's very, very interesting and very clever the way he eventually does bring it in there. So again, that's something we'll look at throughout this. We also want to talk about the Union strategy, their overall plan in the war. It's much more specific than we saw the South's, and it actually has a name. It's called the Anaconda Plan. The Anaconda Plan consists of 4 major parts. The first part is to blockade the South and cut off supplies. What that means is to take that superior navy that the South has and to blockade the southern coast, which is what you can see. This is a cartoon here on the left of the slide depicting the Anaconda Plan, and the name Anaconda Plan was actually meant to be kind of a joke, and this cartoon right here is making fun of it and using that analogy of a snake to make fun of it. But you can see the snake kind of encircling the South there. But they would blockade the coast, blockade the Atlantic, blockade the Gulf of Mexico so that the South couldn't get supplies. We've already talked about how the South is not industrialized. They are dependent on supplies from elsewhere. And so this would cut off their access to all of those things and cripple them. So that's step 1. The second step would be to capture the Mississippi River. So to control all of that. And what that would do was, 1, block the South's access to the Mississippi River. That further blocks their trade, it blocks their transportation, it blocks their communication, but it also kind of cuts the South up. It cuts the Confederacy into pieces. That would cut off your western Confederate states like Texas and Louisiana and Arkansas from the rest of them, so they would be kind of useless to the Confederacy at that point. The third part is to invade through Tennessee and Georgia, cutting another line through the Confederacy, cutting off Mississippi, Alabama, parts of Tennessee, and Georgia. And then the fourth part would be to capture Richmond, which is the Confederate capital. And the thing is, like I said, this was actually originally not a very popular idea, and it was called the Anaconda Plan as a means to make fun of it, as to say, this is silly, this is over elaborate, this is ridiculously hard. There's no reason to do all of this, because remember that everybody thinks going into this that this is going to be quick and easy, 1-2 battles tops. It's not necessary to do all of this. But in the end, this ends up being exactly what the Union Army does, and we are going to see the Union Army pretty much carry out that exact same plan. It just takes 4 years to do it. So let's take a look now at the beginnings of the war, some of the earliest battles, and we're actually going to be looking at about 2 years worth of the war in these 3 battles we're going to look at here. So Fort Sumter was the beginning of the fighting. That was in April of 1861. We're not going to see the fighting really get going for a couple months. Over the next couple of months, both sides are, gathering their forces, they're training their troops, they're getting organized, so forth and so on. And so the first major battle of the war does not occur until July of 1861, specifically July 21st, 1861, near Bull Run Creek, Virginia. And this is going to be the Battle of Bull Run, or sometimes it's called First Bull Run. And this will be your first major battle of the war. So with each of these battles, and we've seen this before with like the Revolution and such, I might go into some of the specifics about tactics and strategies and that kind of stuff. But overall, it is the significance of each battle that you need to take away, why that particular battle is one of hundreds that we actually talk about and that you have to know about. So the basics of this one, just the bare bones basics. When this battle in the first couple of hours of this battle, the Union was actually doing really, really well. The Union had the Confederacy confused. The Confederacy was disorganized. Their lines were breaking. It seemed as if the Union was about to run away with it when Confederate reinforcements arrive under General Stonewall Jackson. And Stonewall Jackson, this is where he gets the nickname Stonewall at this particular battle, and he gets that name, that he was unbreakable, that he was unemotional, he didn't flinch at bullets, he didn't get upset, other than to get excited, but he did not seem worried, and he didn't want his men to do that, all that kind of thing. But anyway, he arrives with reinforcements kind of just at the right time and is able to rally Confederate forces, get them reorganized, and put them back on the offenses, and they force the Union to retreat. So Jackson is able to get everybody reorganized, get them together. They charge the Union Army and force them to retreat, ending the battle in a Confederate victory. And Stonewall Jackson is one of several examples, but one of the best examples of how the South has this superior military leadership at the beginning of the war. He was just incredibly talented as a military commander. There are some military campaigns he leads in parts of the war that people, military strategists and folks like that are still studying, trying to figure out how he did it. He's just kind of able to pull, impossible feats and to do impossible things. But anyway, the Confederacy wins at Bull Run, and the overall importance is that this is, like I said, the first major battle of the war. And then from here on, over the next about a year and a half, the Confederacy continues to do well in this part of the war. And there's two major areas where the war is being fought, or two major what we call theaters of war. All of this is what we call the Eastern Theater. This is everything taking place mostly in Virginia, like this battle. Sometimes it might be Pennsylvania or Maryland, but mostly Virginia. This is the Eastern Theater, and it's in the Eastern Theater that the Confederacy does really, really well, at least for the first 2 years. Even well into the third year, they have a lot of success. But it's a lot of back and forth too. They win a lot of battles, but they're not able to actually bring about an end to it. But remember, that wasn't really their plan. Their plan was to fight defensively, and that's working reasonably well in the Eastern Theater. The other part of the war, though, is what we call the Western Theater. The Western Theater, if you think back to that Anaconda plan, part of their plan was to invade through Tennessee and Georgia and to capture the Mississippi River. So all of that stuff, capturing the Mississippi at first, is what we call the Western Theater. And that's fighting in places like Tennessee and Mississippi and stuff like that, eventually even into Georgia. And it's in that Western Theater that the Union has a little bit more success, at least, not that they're just running away with it, because they're not, but they're making more steady progress when it comes to the Western Theater, whereas the East, it's more of a stalemate and that sort of a thing. So again, this is the Western Theater of the war, Mississippi River region, Tennessee and Georgia, places like that. And now we want to fast forward a little bit to what becomes the first major battle in the West, a battle called the Battle of Shiloh, which took place over 2 days in April of 1862, April 6th and 7th, I believe, near a church called Shiloh Church, thus the name Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee. And this is a 2-day battle. On the first day of fighting, Union forces were surprised and nearly destroyed. They were defeated on that first day. And some of those Union forces, not the entire Union force, but a lot of those Union forces were commanded by General Ulysses S. Grant. Some of you may recognize General Ulysses S. Grant. He does eventually go on to command the entire Union Army, becomes the big hero of the war, eventually becomes president, but at this point in time he is just one of many associate generals in the Union Army, and one that has not made too much of a name for himself. He and his forces are surprised, humiliated, nearly destroyed on that first day. But Grant, although other Union generals were saying, we got to get out of here, we got to redeploy, we need to, get while the getting's good and, fight another day, Grant says, no, we're not going to do that. We're staying. We are going to stay and fight. We're not going to run away. And he is banking on that other reinforcements are going to arrive, that there's other Union forces nearby that are going to be there by the next day to help them fight. So the first day does not go well for the Union. But Grant says, we're staying, we're sticking it out, and he ends up being right. Those reinforcements did arrive. The gamble pays off, and the second day they're able to force the Confederacy to retreat, ending the Battle of Shiloh in a Union victory. So the Battle of Shiloh, first major battle in the West, and it ends up being a Union victory. But the other thing about Shiloh we need to understand is that this was the bloodiest battle up until that point. There's going to be uglier and bloodier things after this, but at this point in time, that was the bloodiest, most deadly battle people had seen, and not just in the Civil War. The Battle of Shiloh was actually the bloodiest conflict at all. And this is a hard statistic to wrap your mind around. Try to be somebody in 1862 reading about this in the newspaper. But more people, if you take the Union and the Confederacy combined, more people died in those 2 days at Shiloh than had died in every single American war, previous American war combined. So if you took the number of all deaths in the entire American Revolution and the entire War of 1812 and the entire Mexican War, it would not equal the number of people that died in just those 2 days. That is something that people just cannot understand and cannot wrap their minds around. So we would think that Grant would be like a big hero after this because he stuck it out and he didn't run. But he actually is disgraced by this because people blame him for those high casualties. And how could he allow that to happen? His career is almost destroyed by Shiloh. It's actually rescued by President Lincoln himself, who was, moved by the way and was impressed by the way that Grant didn't cut and run. So he'll continue to do better from there. But this was so ugly and devastating, and many Americans are definitely beginning to realize at this point that this is not going to be quick and easy. This is not going to be one battle and we're all done. This is going to be long and ugly, and that reality is certainly starting to set in at this point. And to conclude this rather long section, we're going to go back to the Eastern Theater for a moment, fast forward a little bit there, and talk about a battle that becomes a turning point for a couple of different reasons. And some of those reasons we'll talk about now, and some of them we'll look at in the next section. But first, getting the background to this next battle, which is going to be the Battle of Antietam, which occurs September of 1862. First, we need to introduce ourselves to another important figure in the fighting, and that's General Robert E. Lee. General Robert E. Lee will take command of the Confederate Army in the Eastern Theater in early 1862, and he will hold that command throughout the rest of the war. He is another example of superior military leadership, someone that was just very, very good at what they did, and that was able to so many times, do things that were miraculous and do things that nobody had expected and that sort of a thing. Now, we've said that the Confederate strategy has been to fight defensively. Well, by 1862, that had worked. They'd had a lot of victories. Their morale is good, but it hasn't brought about the end of the war. And the Confederacy knows they can't keep this up forever. So for that reason, to try to end the war more quickly, the Confederacy changes their strategy a little bit going into Antietam. This battle is not fought in Virginia, but in Maryland, which, if you remember, was a border state. So the plan for the Confederacy was to invade the North, to, quote, liberate or free Maryland, because from their point of view, Maryland was like a true Confederate state that wanted to secede and should secede, but couldn't, because Lincoln was doing some extreme things that we'll talk about later. And they think if they do this, if Maryland secedes and joins them, that's going to be so devastating to the Union that they'll give up. Or if they have to fight, if they can defeat the Union on their own soil, defeat the Union on Union territory, that will force them to give up. And this would also help them to get foreign recognition. If they can prove to Britain mostly that they can defeat the Union in an offensive battle, not just defensive, but offensive, then that might prompt Britain to recognize them, and that would bring about an end to the war. So the plan going in here was get this thing done more quickly so we invade Maryland. That does not work out the way that they wanted. They thought they'd march right into Maryland and be hailed as heroes and celebrated and all that stuff. That doesn't happen. Maryland does not immediately secede. Most Marylanders are not very impressed with the Confederate Army. And then the Union actually gets their hands on Lee's plans, on the Confederate strategy, because his orders that were written out on paper to all his generals get dropped one day, and the Union picks them up. And so they know what his plan is, and they're able to attack him before he's ready. They're able to kind of get the jump on it. And that leads us into the Battle of Antietam, which occurs on September 17th, 1862, near Antietam Creek in Maryland, near the town called Sharpsburg. And this is a one-day battle that lasts probably less than 12 hours. The Confederates are attacked before they are ready. They are surprised. They are caught off guard, but they're able to kind of get it together. They're able to defend themselves, avoid being destroyed, but they do have to retreat back to Virginia. So they are forced out of Maryland. They do not have a successful offensive victory. You know, there's silver linings to it for them. They could claim it as kind of a victory because they were able to get away. They managed to, not be destroyed when they probably could have. You know, this could have been the end of it, and it wasn't. But they are forced out of Maryland and back into Virginia, so they're not able to get that offensive victory that they wanted. Now, let's take a look at why this battle is important, because it's hugely important for multiple reasons. Again, some of which we're going to talk about right here, right now, and some that's going to come a little bit later. So, significance of the Battle of Antietam. One, it is really your first major Union victory. Now, strategically and technically speaking, it's kind of a tie, because the Union, they forced the Confederacy to retreat, but they could have destroyed them and didn't. They just don't take the opportunity. But they did force them to retreat, and that's the first real time they can say that, and the Union desperately needed that. Their morale was very low. People were really questioning whether or not this was worth fighting anymore, and so this was kind of the victory that they needed to say, we can win this, we have to stay in this is important, the Confederacy's not unbeatable, and we gotta, finish the job. So it was their first Union victory for that, and that's important. It is also a major turning point of the war, because this severely damages the South's chances of getting foreign recognition. One thing historians agree that the South would have had to have really to be able to win the war is to get a foreign country to recognize them as a legitimate nation, as a legitimate government. And after they lose at Antietam, that's no longer going to happen. That's not immediately apparent, that's not immediately clear, but it will be later. But because they failed to win an offensive battle, they failed to win a battle on Union soil, Britain is not going to align themselves with the Confederacy anymore. There's actually another reason, and a bigger reason for that we're going to look at in section 2. It has to do with this thing right here. This Union victory, not only did that boost morale and make people say, okay, we have to keep fighting, this is also what's going to prompt President Lincoln to make a move against slavery. He has up until now avoided and hesitated on the slavery question, because in his mind, there's no point in bringing slavery into this if we're going to lose the war anyway. So when the Union Army kind of shows maybe they could win, that's when he decides to take a move against slavery, and that is really what's going to hurt the South when it comes to foreign countries, because the slavery issue is going to make foreign countries stay away from this whole thing. They don't want to have anything to do with that. It is also, just on a side note, this is the bloodiest single-day battle of the war. It is, I believe, still the bloodiest single day in American history. I think the casualties are somewhere around, I want to say about 23,000 for a one-day battle that was barely even 12 hours long. So this was incredibly ugly and devastating. But that's one of the things we're going to pick up with in section 2, is taking a look at the slavery issue and how this changes the war, and makes it a war about different things, or perhaps just more things than it was when it first got started.